Hello and welcome to another A-Level Russia and Revolution History revision session. Today we're going to be considering why did the Reds win the Civil War, even though they were massively outnumbered. Remember, the harder you work, the luckier you're going to feel in the exam. Hopefully you'll think, yes, I revised this. Okay, so let's have a look then. Why did the Reds win the Civil War? Well, there's 3 or 4 main reasons. Lenin's leadership. Not a massive factor, but it does have an impact. The impact of foreign intervention, disunited nature of the White Army, Trotsky's military leadership, geographical placement of the Reds. These are all factors as to why the Reds won the Civil War. So let's start by having a look at the disunited nature of the White forces. The White forces were disunited. This was because they had different aims. So, for example, some of the White forces wanted the return of the Tsar, and they kind of supported that, and that was their aim. Some of them wanted a dictatorship of the military instead of the Bolsheviks being in power, and some of them just wanted the return of the Constituent Assembly, which had been closed by the Bolsheviks and replaced by the Sovnarkom. But because they were divided in their aims, it meant they didn't have one united aim. They weren't united by one particular leader, and therefore they weren't as good at communicating with each other and working together. And that's seen also by the fact that the Whites were very territorial. A lot of the leaders of the White armies wanted to control land for themselves and to win Russia for themselves. So, for example, you've got Kolchak in Siberia and Denikin in the Donbass region, who, rather than working together, end up kind of being very independent in their attacks, and therefore, like Denikin in the Donbass region, being defeated because they're fighting on too many fronts and they don't have as much of an army to protect them as they would have done if they had agreed to work together. Additionally, they had a lack of communication, obviously because of their divided aims and their kind of very independent wishes. They were very reliant on foreign support for money and for weapons, and they faced a lot of desertions because although they initially had more forces than the Reds did, they were increasingly unpopular with the peasants and with the workers. And one of the reasons for this was that the Whites, when they took over areas of land, reinstated landlords and punished peasants who'd seized land, and they were very harsh. So that led to some peasants leaving the army worried about land issues. And they weren't necessarily won over by the Whites' approach to things. So for these reasons, the Whites became very disunited. They weren't working together, which gave them a lack of a military advantage, and also they lost the support of the peasants through their methods when they did win areas of land. The impact of foreign interventions is another important factor, perhaps equally important as the disunited nature of the Whites, because the Whites were reliant on foreign support, as we've mentioned already. It made the Whites appear to be fighting against Mother Russia because they're reliant on a foreign force, and they were often fighting from the peripheries of Russia, so it made it look like they weren't really fighting for the good of Russia necessarily. The foreign intervention was divided. There wasn't one single aim either from this intervention. Although initially they had an interest in Russia's commitment to World War I, when World War I ended in 1918, they no longer had a single aim. So, for example, Japan and the US wanted to protect trade, Poland wanted independence, and for this reason, again, they weren't united in their efforts against the Bolsheviks, and they weren't communicating as effectively as they could be, and they couldn't agree on what they wanted, which meant that they were not a united force against the Russian Red Bolshevik forces. Lenin's leadership is not necessarily a particularly important factor in why the Reds managed to win the Civil War, but it did have an impact. Whilst he was in charge, they moved the capital from Petrograd, or St. Petersburg as it was now known, to Moscow, so it was further away from the Whites and Yudenich, who were in the north of Russia. Which meant that they were maybe a little bit more secure than they had otherwise been from attack. and they used the Cheka to remove the political opposition to the Bolsheviks that they could. So, for example, in 1918, 50,000 people were killed at the hands of a Cheka. And also the Cheka, under the control, ultimately, I guess, of Lenin, killed the Tsar in 1918, so that there wasn't a focus for the opposition, the white opposition, who wanted to go back to the old ways to the Tsar, because the Tsar and his family had all been killed. So in some ways that did help them win the war, but it didn't get rid of the opposition of Denikin and Yudenich and others. Additionally, there was the introduction of laws like the conscription law in May 1918, which increased the number of people in the Red Army from 3 million to 5.4 million by 1920. So these things did improve the situation that the military were in. They had a large number of forces, people were more bound to support them, and also the capital city was safer and less likely to get taken over than it might otherwise have been if Lenin hadn't moved it. However, it's arguably not necessarily as an important factor as the disunited nature of the whites themselves, because if the whites had been united in their fight, then maybe moving the capital and slightly increasing the number of forces still wouldn't have matched the number of the forces of the whites. Geographic placement is a really key reason as to why the Reds were able to win the Civil War. For example, geographic placement of the Reds meant that they controlled the key cities, which were the most populated areas, which meant they had more access to manpower and people that they could conscript into the army. It also meant that they had access to the factories, which were now government controlled under war communism. And that meant that they could focus the creation of munitions as being the focus of the factories. So this gave them an advantage that they might not otherwise have done. Additionally, where the Reds were, there were reserves left over from World War I. So, for example, there were 2.5 million rifles and 28 million shells available for them to use. Moreover, we've got the control of the railways, so therefore, because they're in the kind of key areas where the railways are, it was easy for them to move their troops around. So it was, although they had less troops, they were able to use the same forces and then transport them quite quickly to fight against both Kolchak and Denikin and also Yudenich, just by moving them around the country. So even though they were outnumbered by the Allies and by the whites, they could still beat them using the same number of forces. So another reason why access to the railways enabled the Reds to win the Civil War was that Trotsky was able to visit battlefronts in an armoured train. So he was able to move around the country really easily and communicate with all the different forces who were fighting, and make sure that he kept them up to date with what the battle plans were and kept morale high as well. And finally, the whites were fighting at the periphery of Russia, so it was hard for them to communicate in the same way as the Reds, which meant that even if they had wanted to work together, which they didn't particularly, it wasn't very easy for them to communicate with the different forces and the different groups. Finally, and probably most importantly, the Reds were able to win the Civil War because of Trotsky's military leadership. This is perhaps equally as important, if not more important, than the geographical factors, because he was the person who made sure that the troops stayed loyal and didn't desert. So there were a huge number of desertions in the white forces, but in the red forces there were a much, much smaller number of desertions, partly because Trotsky used the death sentence for desertion, and also because he introduced a military oath, the socialist military oath, in April 1918, which meant that there were less desertions as well. People felt a sense of loyalty to their army, and he introduced the term comrade. So comrade would be put before whatever the name was of the duty of the person that they're talking to. So comrade, captain, sort of introducing the idea of the socialist ideology within the army. He was also clever in that he employed ex-Tsarist officers to train the troops. Although this seems initially quite shocking, it was really key in enabling the Reds to win, because the Reds didn't have the military expertise that they required, and ex-Tsarist officers would have done, and he made sure that they stayed loyal by, unfortunately, taking hostage family members so that they wouldn't go against the Bolshevik ideas. He managed to maintain a large number of forces, so he had about 5 million soldiers by 1920 within the army. Additionally, he introduced things like the Red Banner, which was a medal, and it was introduced to increase morale in the ordinary troops and soldiers by rewarding them for their efforts. And all of these things, as well as his kind of going to the battlefronts and armoured trains and communication, all enabled the Reds to win, because it meant that although they had a smaller number of troops, those troops stayed loyal, and he managed to keep morale high enough that the troops continued fighting and didn't mutiny against what was happening. And he also managed to keep communication lines open, so it was easy for them to take advantage fully of all the munitions and the transportation that they could to focus the troops where they needed to be most at the time when he's fighting on all these different fronts in Russia. So if you consider all the things that we've discussed, make your own mind up. What do you think the main reason was that the Reds managed to win the Civil War despite being outnumbered by the White troops? Was it the impact of foreign intervention, disunited nature of the Whites, Trotsky's military leadership, their geographical placement, or Lenin's leadership? As a side note, if you ever wanted to consider the causes of the Civil War, you could also consider these things. There were roughly 33 governments, or theoretically governments, created by June 1918. They were all groups who wanted to declare their independence from Russia, as national minority groups and others as well. There were the Allies who were angry about the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and they wanted Russia to get re-involved in World War One. For example, Churchill sent £100 million to help the Whites forces to fight against the Reds. Peasants were angry and they were seizing land still. Some of them didn't feel that the decree on land went far enough. The Cheka were arresting people without trial, and it made people a bit uneasy. There was the loss of Ukraine as part of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was known as the breadbasket of Europe. It meant they lost areas where the grain was created, it increased inflation, and there was rationing of bread, so only you were allowed 50 grams of bread per day in around June 1918. The kulaks were accused of grain hoarding. The Constituent Assembly had been closed. They excluded the Social Revolutionaries, the Bolsheviks. So all of these things created a situation where the Bolsheviks didn't fully have the support of the country, and there's different groups who all want to break away and fight for the right to their own land or to rule Russia. See if you can do some active revision with the information we've talked about today. So either teaching someone else about the topic, or planning yourself an essay, or it could be that you create some flashcards and you test yourself on each of these different factors, and how much can you remember without checking the answers. Then check the answers, see what you missed out, and have another go, and keep doing it again and again and again, hence revision over and over and over, until you get it right. Good luck with your revision.